But we're going to start by, when we look at children, it's always going to start, sorry, I this it's always, the starting point of the conversation around children is always families. We know that families are the most natural social unit in any culture. It doesn't matter what culture we talk about, it doesn't matter what society we're talking about. Families are the most natural social unit in any culture, and they are always the most natural environment in which children are raised. As Christians, though, we also know that families are not immune to being impacted by sin and all of the effects of sin and dysfunction and different social issues that can create high degrees of vulnerability in families that in turn then impact children and impact the way that families can care for their children, support their children and protect their children. So families can be in dysfunction, they can be in crisis situations, and they can experience breakdown, or they can experience a risk of breakdown. As Christians, we also know that we have a very clear biblical call and mandate to respond to families that are in crisis, and in particular to children in crisis. The Bible is very clear about that. There are many, many scriptures that talk about our responsibility to reach out to and support children who are vulnerable, orphan children, fatherless children, and also other people that are disadvantaged or at risk or vulnerable in our society. But we also, as much as we have a mandate or responsibility to respond, I think the Bible is equally clear in saying that we have a responsibility to really consider how we respond. So we're talking about two things, a mandate to respond and a responsibility to consider how we outwork that mandate and that response. And that's really where we're focusing now. All of these conversations that we'll have tonight and that you may have been having outside of the school around children's care, none of it is about discouraging Christians from putting their hand up, from sacrificing in the way that Lisa talked about in her own personal journey, that many of you will have done in your own journeys, and actually putting resource, or whether it's going, or however it is we engage in getting involved in supporting vulnerable children. But what we are talking about is the methodology, the how. How do we do that? How do we understand what is the right type of response that doesn't just look at children's issues in a small or a narrow sense or in a vacuum, but looks at children's needs, at children's rights, and at children's flourishing and well-being in a very holistic way. And I think the Bible actually gives us a lot of clues about that. This verse here is one of my favorites. Learn to do what is good, seek justice, correct the oppressor, defend the rights of the fatherless, and plead the widow's cause. So this really does talk about how, because it tells us one really critical thing, and that is defending the rights of the fatherless. A big part of what we're called to do is actually look at human rights, the context of children's rights. And what role do we play as individual Christians, as a body, as a corporate church, not this particular church per se, but as a global church? What role do we have in defending the rights of children? And in particular, one of the core rights of a child that's both reflected in, if you look back into, into the laws in Moses' time, into Old Testament legal frameworks, one of the key rights of a child is their right to a family. So many of the verses in the Old Testament that actually talk about protecting children or defending the fatherless child, defending the orphan child, they're actually talking to judges in a context, in a legal framework of the Old Testament, where the child's rights were very, very much linked to the father, the lineage of the father, inheritance rights, all of those things flowed down the father's line. And so when a child became fatherless, they actually became vulnerable at having their rights violated, at losing their inheritance, at losing their protection under the law. So many of those verses, the context of it is actually a call to judges and magistrates and those that had a mandate to protect rights and uphold legal rights for vulnerable people, to actually not take advantage of that child's position of vulnerability and to not just meet their needs, but actually protect the rights that were enshrined within the law. And so we carry that into modern day, outside of Mosaic law, into any other legal framework. We have a responsibility to really look at what children's rights are and the role that we play in upholding those rights. And that concept of children's rights and children's right to a family is a concept that is also equally reflected in international child rights law. Our international child rights law is There's a number of different treaties that form part of the canon of international child rights law, but the key one is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which many of you would be familiar with. And it is the most widely ratified human rights treaty globally. And it's been ratified well and truly above and beyond the point at which it becomes binding international law, which means that every country that has ratified this, and a fun fact for you is the only country that hasn't ratified the UNCRC is America, it's the US. Every other country in the world has. But the US has taken every single article of the CRC and embedded it in their domestic legislation. So every country in the world, including the US, has a legal responsibility that is binding to the articles of children's rights. The very starting point, the preamble, the premise for all the other articles in the CRC is that convinced that the family, as a fundamental group of society and the natural environment for the growth and well-being of all its members, particularly children, should be afforded the necessary protection and assistance so it can fully assume its responsibilities in community. It is an underpinning preamble to all the articles in the CRC, and it places a strong emphasis on the importance of families, the role that families play in children's care, and the requirement for the state, government, and anybody who comes under the state's jurisdiction, which includes any civil society organisation working in any country, to uphold the rights and the importance of the family. There's a number of other articles in the CRC that also talk about children's rights to family, whether that's around identity and documentation, or around the responsibility of government not to interfere with family functioning, and the responsibility of government to resource families who are struggling to independently fulfill their role and responsibility around caregiving of children to make that feasible for that particular family. So children, both in domestic law, in international law, and very well and clearly reflected in the Bible, have a right to a family, and family, which we understand is God's design, is reflected in those international instruments. But despite that, despite the importance placed on family from every society, from every legal perspective, from a biblical perspective, in our world today, there is an estimated 8 million children who are not living in families, who are living separated from their families, and who are growing up in various forms of what we call residential care, which can be orphanages, children's centres, children's homes, children's villages, or what we call compound foster care. So it's more like the village model, where you might have smaller homes with a mum and dad figure and a few children in a home, but all living on one compound community. That's also classified under residential care. Shelters, transit centres, and boarding homes in many situations also come under that banner of residential care. So the figures are a bit difficult to pin down, but the estimates are that it's around about 8 million children living in residential care in some manner in different countries around the world. And what we have accompanying these data, these numbers, is a nearly 75-year now body of research and evidence from across the whole world, not just coming from one country or one region, but from all countries and all regions, that demonstrate that there are some pretty significant and can be very detrimental impacts on children's development when children grow up separated from families, grow up removed from their communities in residential care situations. So we're going to have a look at what some of those impacts are. Now, taking into account that not every child will experience all of these impacts. Not every care setting, the way it's structured, will expose children to all of these different types of risks. So there is a lot of variance. It sits on a bit of a continuum, but these are the well-documented risks that are quite serious and can really have a big impact on a child's development. So we're going to start with attachment disorders. So attachment theory, that some of you are probably well aware of, is basically when a child is born, having that relationship with a primary caregiver or a small group of primary caregivers that allows that child to develop a strong emotional bond is really central to a child's development, particularly for young children. When a child is not able to form that attachment, or when that attachment has been broken because a child has been removed from their family and placed into residential care, or where the family functioning is dysfunctional to the degree where the attachment is not facilitated. It actually affects the way a child's brain develops. So in our brains, in children's brains, you have these soft neurological pathways that don't form and become permanent pathways until around somewhere between the ages of 5 and 8. And those pathways don't form unless the child first and foremost has a strong attachment. We often think about giving children lots of stimulus to help those neurological pathways, to stimulate them and to help them to form. But unless a child has a secure attachment to underpin that, a child can't engage with the stimulus in their environment because they lack the security of attachment that is necessary for that engagement to occur. So what we actually see, and there's lots of brain neuroscience, you can look at different scans, comparing the brain scans of children who grew up in institutions with the brain scans of children who've grown up in families. There's ones that compare them to biological family care and to family-based care, so foster care or kinship care. And what you see is some very vast differences in the activity in particular regions of their brain, particularly around the domains that look at control of emotions and control of reaction and decision making. And so children who don't have that opportunity to form a strong attachment when they're little can actually undergo differences in their brain development that have a lifelong impact on them. We also see that children who lack attachment are more likely to suffer from issues such as low self-esteem, a lack of sense of belonging and identity, pessimistic view of self, of others, of community, society, inability to formulate and to maintain healthy relationships. So you'll often see in an orphanage or a residential care centre, if any of you have been to visit at any point or you've seen videos and different things, often when you go in and you're not known to the child, one of the first things you'll see is children will run up to you and they'll be quite friendly with you. And when we look at this, unless we're sort of understanding this through a child development lens, it looks like the kids are really happy. And these are really well-adjusted kids. They're really familiar, they're comfortable, they're not scared, they're not timid. But if you put that in the context of normal child behaviour, if you think about your own children or children in your own life, your own world, you'll be able to reflect and see that that's actually not very normal. Normally a child, I've got a 7-year-old, and even at 7, she still has a good grip on my leg when she's put in a situation where she's not familiar with people. And she's pretty friendly, and she's a pretty gutsy kid, but before she's game to start to talk to someone she doesn't know, she's going to watch. She's going to hang behind me first. She's going to watch how mum reacts to that person, try to get a sense of is this person a safe person, and then gradually she'll become comfortable and she'll kind of come out from behind me and she'll start to forge a relationship with that person. But it's not immediate. When you see that immediate, very affectionate reaction from a child who is not known to you, that is one of the most classic symptoms of a reactive attachment disorder. It's showing you that the child doesn't have the normal inhibitions that come from understanding stranger danger and having a solid attachment with a primary caregiver. That means that the way they develop other relationships is more normative and healthy. And so that's very common in orphanages and institutions, to see children have those issues and to unnaturally bond with people very quickly. Now, if you think about that when a child leaves care at 16 or 17 or 18, if that attachment issue hasn't been addressed in their life and they still are trying to fill that void by unnaturally attaching themselves to people, that leaves that young person incredibly vulnerable. And that's why we see, well, it's one of the compounding factors that results in a lot of care leavers and teenagers who leave institutions being targeted by traffickers, by drug cartels, by a lot of other very dangerous people who know that these young people are highly vulnerable and who are quite easily targeted and quite easily drawn into these kinds of situations. And so it creates a hyper vulnerability in children. We also see a lot of academic and behavioural problems, and as I said before, cognitive delays that can come from that altered brain structure when a child doesn't have that attachment. Let's see how long our battery's going to last. So some other issues around institutionalisation that are obviously generalised but are quite common is things like poor social skills. So children who grow up in an institution grow up in a world of children. In our research in Cambodia, where there was research conducted amongst 500 institutions, and children from across these various institutions, so many of them echoed the same sentiment in saying, we understand children, we don't understand adults because they grow up in a world of peers and staff, not in a normal community environment where you've got younger, older aunts, uncles, grandparents, elders, village leaders, teachers, and all these different social relationships. And it's in that environment where children learn to understand how they are supposed to behave with respect to different people in their communities. Particularly when most cultures, Western cultures, the anomaly, are very hierarchical. And so knowing how to respond to someone who's your mother's age or your grandmother's age is really, really it's important in terms of being able to establish and maintain relationships with people. Children who grow up in these institutions don't live in an environment where they can actually learn those skills. And so we tend to see that many of them are, have poor social skills when they leave the institutions, which then impacts their ability to sustain employment, to again compound with the attachment issues around developing healthy relationships. We see a lot of behavioural issues and cognitive issues as a result of institutionalisation. So my husband and I, we fostered a number of children when we were living in Cambodia and adopted one. And they all came from institutions, all but one came from institutions. And our younger children who have been placed in institutions as babies, who had all those very classic symptoms of brain cognitive developmental delays and so forth, we would see a lot of fuzzy autistic behaviours in them, which are really common in particularly young children who've been placed in institutions. Self-soothing, rocking, biting, head banging. And if you didn't know these children, you might look at them and say they're autistic. There's a lot of that quasi-autistic behaviour. That's quite common, and that's a product of institutionalisation, particularly the self-soothing behaviours. If you think about growing up in an environment where there aren't very many caregivers in relationship to how many children there are, children aren't able to get that soothing from adult caregivers, and so they'll develop those behaviours to self-soothe. Poor decision-making skills. This is a common one. If you know much about orphanages, you'll often, one of the first things you'll see when you walk into an orphanage is a schedule printed out and stuck on the wall somewhere. And if you've got 30 children, 40 children, 25 children, 60 children, you're going to need some pretty great routines to manage to maneuver that many children through all the different things that need to happen in a day and get things done and maintain some semblance of control. So what those very scheduled environments do is they deny children the opportunities to make normative decisions. That therefore hampers their decision-making skills development. They are used to being shepherded through every event in their life. Things are so regimented, they don't learn to make decisions. And so when they leave the institution, and again, these are compounding dynamics, not all individuals. When they leave, it's very common that you'll see that care leavers really struggle to make decisions. When they're faced with very basic tasks, they freeze. They don't know how to make those decisions. They don't know how to weigh up consequences. They will look for environments that will create the same structured routines. And that's why you see a lot of care leavers go from institutions into aftercare programs, into NGO dormitories, into other very structured environments, or often will return back to the orphanages. Very common to find young people who grow up in orphanages return back to start orphanages or run orphanages, and often it's because that's the environment in which they know how to survive and thrive. It's the environment that provides that structure that they're comfortable with. And then lack of just basic life skills. I'm not growing up in a normal community and family environment where you absorb all those normal skill development opportunities that children who grow up in institutions may not have. In institutions, we also see that there is a much higher risk of abuse, which is confronting because orphanages are set up to protect children. But because it's outside of the care of family, because of a lot of different issues, a lack of regulation, the fact that in a lot of developing countries, on average, 2/3 of orphanages are not registered, they're not operating lawfully, they're not on anyone's radar, they're not being monitored. Often they're being run by people who aren't trained in child development or child protection, so they may lack the understanding of how to actually safeguard children. Many orphanages are placed quite outside of community because of issues around getting access to large enough blocks of land to set up a home that will provide space for children, but that isolates children and means there isn't a protective environment around those children. And so all of those things together, coupled with the fact that preferential child sex abusers target orphanages. And they will often go in as volunteers, they will go in as board members, they will go and seek employment opportunities within these institutions, they will go in as donors, and they target institutions because they know those children are not in an environment that provides the normative protection of a family and a community, so they're more vulnerable. And that, again, coupled with the attachment issues and so forth, means it's a lot easier to groom a child who's in an institution than it is to groom a child in community. So all those things put together, and the rates of abuse in institutions are scary and very, very high. It's not always adults abusing children either. There's a lot of child-on-child abuse in orphanages, and that comes from bringing children with troubled backgrounds, children who have broken attachments, who don't have stable bonds with other adults or people in the world who are trying to fulfill that sense of belonging. You bring all those issues in under one roof, and then you don't have adequate safeguards and adequate supervision, and you've got a recipe for an environment that can lead to a lot of child-on-child abuse as well. So the rates of different types of abuse in institutions are quite high. And as I said before, these issues affect children well into their adulthood, not just in the duration of their time in institution. In fact, a lot of people who've had experience running orphanages will say, well, I don't see those issues in my children. A lot of the time when you will see them is when they leave. When they either get into their teenage years or when they leave care, and that's when you'll really start to see these issues outplayed. We see a lot of care leavers really struggle when they get married. They haven't grown up understanding the relationships between husbands and wives in their culture. So they don't know what that relationship looks like. They've not ever been able to develop a lifelong bond with their own parents. And so when they have a child, they don't know how to develop that bond. It's an amazing amount of times we see children who grow up in care when they get to that age of having their own children, not know how to bond with their baby. And what you think is one of the most natural things in the world becomes a really alien task to someone who's not had that experience personally. A lot of issues in marriage, again.
It's all happening, isn't it?
You're right. Again, because they've not seen that, they've not grown up in that family, seeing those marital relationships, husband and wife relationships, and so they'll struggle with them. And that can create a lot of tension in households. So we see these issues follow them through. Now, a lot of young people will overcome these issues. They will develop resilience over time. They will develop support networks to overcome these issues. So it's not a case of every single child who's grown up in an institution or spent time in an orphanage is going to suffer all of these things for the rest of their life. But they're certainly significant. They're statistically very, very high. And there are quite a number of, a high percentage of young people who will carry some of these effects throughout the duration of their life. It's amazing how many times I do a presentation like this, even in Australia, particularly if I do this in an area that has an Indigenous population. It's amazing the number of adults that will come up to me and say, I understand myself better after listening to what you said. I never knew why I struggled with these issues until I was able to hear this presentation. So some of those issues, and these are 50-year-old, 60-year-old, people who were separated from their families as children in Australia, or in other countries when we do that there. So it definitely has a lifelong impact. So with all that in mind, it begs the question of why are there 8 million children in these care environments if the risks are so high? Even if we do everything in our power to make these orphanages the best, the highest standards and so forth, there are some things we can mitigate through having good programming, good standards, good child protection measures. There's some things about institutionalisation that we can't mitigate, even with the highest standards of programs. So why have we got all of these children who are growing up in these institutions? And the answer, we often have been led to believe that most of these children are there because they have no other options. They're there because they're orphans. They're there because they have no caregivers, because they have no parents. But the reality is 80%, that's a global statistic collated from all the countries and regions across the world. So we see a variance between around about 76% up to around about 94% in the Eastern European bloc. So on average, 80% of all children who are growing up in institutions today have parents who are alive. And in most cases, most of that percentage of children, there aren't abuse issues in those families. The majority of the issues that have led to that separation are poverty or education-related issues. Disability is another big driver, but poverty and education are the two key ones. Of that smaller percentage of children who are orphans, most of those, when we do family tracing, when we conduct assessments and look for families who could care for them in their extended family network, very rare that we don't find a relative, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent who could resume care of that child if supported properly. The vast majority of children who are orphaned, who are, sometimes you'll hear the term double orphan, who've lost both mum and dad, most of those children never hit an institution in the first place. They're absorbed immediately into an extended family network in the community. So the most common use of institutions is not to respond to abandonment or to respond to orphanhood. It's a response to poverty. And that's the other common misunderstanding around this space, is that if children who are in care have parents, they must have been abandoned by their parents. But what we find is many times parents are making a decision to place their children into care, or they've had someone come to their community and recruit children into care, and they've either been coerced or they've made a decision, they've weighed up their options and said, I can't feed all my children. I've got 6 kids and I can't feed and educate all of them. So I'm going to send 2 of them to an orphanage, and that reduces the financial pressure on the whole family. I can care for 4 kids if they'll take financial responsibility for 2. These are parents making a decision in most cases, and what they're doing is making a decision out of the options that have been presented to them. And what's not being presented to parents in the majority of cases is the option to be supported to care for their own children. They're being presented with the no support option, continue on the pathway you're on and face poverty and the likelihood that you can't feed and care for your children, or send them to an institution where they will be provided for in that manner. And so parents are making a decision. Most parents have no there's no consideration in their mind that they won't maintain a relationship with their children. They're not looking at this as a severing of their parental rights or responsibilities. They are simply making the best choice available to them so that their children can get access to education or food. So we can see there's a mismatch between the type of care system we have in many of these countries and the needs of the children. We've got a poverty, education, sometimes disability, sometimes issues of family dysfunction, but again, that's a smaller proportion. We've got these issues as drivers, but we've got institutional care as the primary response being put forward to children. But it basically presents a gap between what the issues are and what the responses that are being given to children. So what are the right responses? What should we be looking at that best meets those needs of the children at the same time as really upholding their broader rights? And this is where we bring in what's called the United Nations Guidelines on the Alternative Care of Children. And as I said before, this all comes under a field of international child rights law. And the sections of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child that deal with alternative care, that deal with children's right to be provided adequate care when they're not able to live with their families, is then further unpacked in these guidelines called the Guidelines on the Alternative Care of Children that were adopted by the UN General Assembly. I think it was in '89. And these are quite detailed, and they look at all the provisions for what countries need to do to make sure that their alternative care sectors are operating in accordance with international law. And in those guidelines, again, one of the key statements around this says that removal of a child from the care of the family should always be seen as a measure of last resort and should be, wherever possible, temporary and for the shortest duration possible. So what that means and how that translates into most governments' alternative care policies is that residential care is a last resort and temporary option used for the shortest duration possible to prevent long-term separation from their families when it's not necessary. The guidelines also say that financial and material poverty or conditions uniquely imputable to such poverty should never be the only justification for the removal of a child from parental care, for receiving a child into alternative care, or for preventing his or her reintegration, but should be seen as a signal for the need to provide appropriate support to the family. So what this is basically saying is that when we are faced with issues of poverty or issues of service access, whether that's disability services or education services, our response should not be to encourage the separation of that child from their family. Our response should be to be directing resources to communities and families to overcome the root causes of those issues and maintain children within their families and within their communities. So we need to be overcoming the poverty, we need to be overcoming the access to education or other issues with the resources we have to direct towards children's care. So in order to actually do that, there's a shift that needs to take place, because what we have at the moment is an over-dependence on residential care that is, it's not in accordance, it's not aligned with the need. Now, we're not saying there's no need for residential care, there is. Residential care is a part of the recognised continuum of care, which is basically the options that are available to children or need to be made available to children when they legitimately require out of parental care. But what we have is these two pillars within the UN guidelines, the necessity pillar and the suitability pillar. And the necessity pillar is our first filter. When we are confronted with a child who is vulnerable or at risk or found separated from their family, our first consideration is alternative care necessary? Or are other interventions more suitable and appropriate to the child's needs? So if the issue is education, separation is not necessary. Alternative care is not necessary. What's necessary is education support. If it's poverty, then separation is not necessary. Separation from family or alternative care is used when we hit a threshold, which is a risk of significant harm. So it's a child protection intervention, and it's supposed to be for situations where it's unsafe for that child to remain with their family because the risk of harm is significant and can't be mitigated through intervention. It's at that point that it warrants the child's removal and placement in alternative care, at which point we then consider the second pillar, which is the suitability pillar. What type of care best suits the child? remembering that residential care is a last resort, a temporary option, because of all the detrimental impacts that residential care can cause on a child's development. So that means if they need care, we're looking at other family types of care. We're looking at foster care, kinship care, other options that reduce the likelihood of institutionalisation and maintain a child within their family, which maintains their rights. So we need to move from this situation of overdependence on institutional care to undergo a process which is called care reform, reforming the systems of care in different countries. To do that, we need to place a higher priority on preserving families, on actually looking at those vulnerabilities in community, in the family context, and addressing that through family preservation services, which we have here in Australia. We have intense social work support, we have in cash, in kind, social protection mechanisms, stipends, all those different things. We have pension cards, or we have concession cards, all those types of things are part of the government's family strengthening and family preservation mechanisms that try to help families be able to invest in their own children's care rather than get to the point of children needing to be removed. The second thing we need to do is prioritise family-based care. So we need to move towards developing the foster care systems, the kinship care support structures, so that when children do need to be removed from families or can't remain with families, or there are no legitimate biological family options, that they have other family-based care options available to them. And that also includes things like child-headed households, which in some countries there's a provision for that within the law, and in some countries there isn't. Residential care is, again, that last resort temporary options, but even then what we're looking at is trying to scale down the residential care options we have to be very small, family-like units that are therapeutic in their nature. And they can then help to rehabilitate a child over a shorter period of time to help position them to be able to go back into a family or into family-based care when those underlying issues have been addressed. So this is the continuum of care here. And you can see there are different categories. You've got your family-based care options, community-based care, and your residential care options. And so this presents the scope of options that we need to be resourcing and developing in every country, so that when we do come in contact with a child, we're not having to put them in an orphanage by default of not having these other types of services available. From our vantage point here, whether we're supporters, partner organisations, donors, volunteers, it's about us redirecting our resource into developing these types of alternatives. When the resource remains over-concentrated in orphanages, we don't have the ability to actually diversify those services and start to develop other types of family-based care, or start to develop family strengthening and family preservation services. And so we end up in this continuous cycle of the only option available to children in those countries is to go into the orphanages. So this is the deinstitutionalisation process, or the care reform process. And it involves these different stages. So looking at the children who are currently in orphanages, and we go through a process of reunifying them with their families. Now, that doesn't mean every child who's currently in an orphanage will go home. There's a very robust assessment framework that's wrapped around that, where every child is assessed, every family is assessed, and then a placement decision will be made on the basis of what's in the best interest of each individual child. And where that shows that they can go home with support, then the child will then be reunified with their family. It also involves redirecting the resources, as we just mentioned, scaling back the number of orphanages in a given country. Where there's too many orphanages, those orphanages will continually act as a pull factor. By nature of them being funded, by nature of them having resource, it creates a demand. And so we end up with children who are being pulled out of families and into those institutions just because they're there. We also see in a lot of countries that orphanages are becoming a business model. And that's a lot around what the Australian inquiry, the parliamentary inquiry, was looking into. The fact that orphanages have become businesses. Overseas operators, and not all of them obviously, but unscrupulous ones, have cottoned on to the fact that particularly Western countries have a really soft heart towards children in orphanages, particularly if we've been led to believe those children are very vulnerable, have no families, have no parents. And so it's quite easy to get donations or get funding from overseas charities and churches to start an orphanage. So we now have a situation where people are setting these orphanages up intentionally for the purpose of getting funding, and they are actively recruiting children from families into these orphanages, keeping them in a situation of servitude and exploitation so that they can make money off them. The children who are being presented to us as orphans are actually being commoditized, going through a process which is called paper orphaning, where many of them are having their names changed, fake documentation that states that their parents have died, fake birth certificates, being brought into these care environments. And that's an act of trafficking. And that's what our Australian government is now looking at prosecuting under our criminal code, under our trafficking provisions in our criminal code. And so it's really important that we scale back the numbers and that we have good policies and processes to prevent orphanages from becoming businesses and prevent children from being commoditized. One aspect of redirecting resources is volunteering. Volunteering in orphanages, or which is sometimes called orphanage tourism, when it takes place in the context of overseas travel, where someone's going on a holiday, and sometimes a package will have built into it a day where they go and volunteer in an orphanage. Or sometimes you'll be in Cambodia and you'll be in a tuk-tuk, and on the back of your tuk-tuk will be a list of things you can do. Pay $20 and shoot launch a rocket, or shoot a gun. I don't know anything about guns. I can't tell you what type of guns. I know they're big guns. Or you can visit an orphanage, and you can build these things into a package, and the tuk-tuk drivers will take you there for a fee. Again, that's feeding into the business model of the orphanages, and so we are seeing a direct correlation between high tourist sites and the number of institutions being established. For example, in Cambodia, there was a 70% increase in the number of orphanages in the country from 2010 to 2015, despite there being an equal drop in the numbers of children who were orphaned or in need of alternative care. And all those new orphanages were popping up where there was international airports and key tourist sites. They advertise tours, they advertise dance shows. Children are sent out during the day to hand out flyers, inviting tourists to come to their orphanage and volunteer with them. Children are being asked to stand up night after night and recount stories of abuse and trauma to elicit the sympathies of tourists and donors. Children are being kept malnourished. They're being kept in substandard conditions, so that when you go and visit them and volunteer with them, it creates an emotional reaction. And donors are then told, if you give us more money, we can feed the children better. We can't feed them because we don't have the money. That money's not going to the children, it's going into the business model. And so we are seeing a situation of deep exploitation of these children taking place within the context of the orphanage industry. Again, not every orphanage director is exploiting children, not every orphanage is doing the wrong thing, not every child who's in an orphanage is being exploited. But the orphanage tourism or volunteering dynamic is one of the direct drivers of the orphanage industry, and that's why there's been quite a push, particularly in Australia but other countries as well, to look at really banning that practice and instituting legislation that would really look at the facilitation of orphanage tourism as a type of business activity that leads to servitude. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a moment, but I want to just show you this quick video that really captures some of the issues around orphanage tourism. You want the lights off first, or okay? I'm going to get you some water.
I'm going on a short-term missions trip.
I'm going with the team for my church.
We're going to Cambodia.
We're going to Uganda.
We're going to Guatemala.
I'm not entirely sure what to expect.
I decided to go because I wanted to experience mission firsthand.
I want to contribute.
I wanted to volunteer in an orphanage.
But then I found out by doing so,
I could do more harm than good.
You see, experts all agree that orphanages are not the best environments for children and can actually cause long-term harm. Children develop best in families, which makes sense. It's God's design. Most children in orphanages aren't orphans. 80% have living parents and are primarily in care because of poverty, disability, or to access education. But these issues should be addressed by strengthening families and communities, not by removing children. Allowing volunteers into orphanages therefore encourages the wrong type of response and can also increase the risk of abuse or harm for children in care. Orphanages are a known target for people who seek opportunities to abuse children, and when orphanages open their doors to good volunteers, they open them to everyone. Using short-term volunteers to provide care for children can also exacerbate children's attachment issues. Children can form an attachment with their volunteer caregiver, only to have it broken when the volunteer leaves. This cycle of attachment and abandonment repeats with every volunteer and can cause emotional harm, particularly in young children. Perhaps what concerns me most is how the popularity of orphanage volunteering in some countries is creating an industry. A demand for children in orphanages fueled by a ready supply of overseas volunteers willing to donate to visit them. To meet this demand, children are being recruited from families and placed into care. Unbeknownst to most of us, these children are rarely orphans at all, but commodities in an industry that depends on their exploitation.
So, I'm going on a short-term mission trip.
And I'm going to use my time to support vulnerable children.
But I won't be volunteering in an orphanage.
I want to be a part of supporting families
And strengthening communities.
And advocating for children have the opportunity to grow up in a family where they belong.
Okay, so the video covered this, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. But as you heard in there, volunteering in orphanages contributes to the vulnerability and heightens the risk for children. Even when we are going into a good orphanage, we're still saying that we need to ban this practice, because even if the orphanage that you're volunteering or visiting isn't one that is trafficking children or keeping children in care for too long, because if they let them go home when it's time or when they are able to return home, they'll lose the sponsorship money or the profitability of the child. It contributes to that perception that there is a demand for children in care to provide that volunteerism service to overseas visitors. And so when someone is watching lots of different volunteers coming and going into even the better run orphanages, it's still feeding into that perception that there's an industry and there's money to be made. We also think about this from the perspective of what would be appropriate in my country. Would I be allowed to volunteer in a child protection unit here in Australia? They are spaces where our most vulnerable children are cared for, and they're not spaces open to lots of different people coming in and out and providing very short stints of care to those children. Children who legitimately need to be in orphanages or residential care are children who have very, very special needs. The children that need people with very specialised training are usually therapeutic skills to really provide the type of care that's going to help rehabilitate them. And that's very, very uncommon for that type of specialisation to be found in someone who's coming over to volunteer for a day or a week. And even if they are, that short term, that turnover of volunteering contributes to the attachment issues, as the video said. And so it's not really an issue of looking at volunteering in the good orphanages versus the bad orphanages. It's really an issue of saying it's not appropriate for volunteers to be working in overseas orphanages unless they're going to be there for a very long time. We're talking about long-term volunteering, and these are skilled volunteers who come with a specialised training, therapeutic skills and experience and qualifications to work with children who are at risk and children who require that type of care. So it's going to be very, very rare that it would be considered appropriate to volunteer at an orphanage for all of those different reasons. And I, in my line of work, I can't tell you the types of cases I see on a daily basis of children being exploited in the most disgusting and disturbing ways because they've been able to access those children through volunteering opportunities, through church trips. And sometimes we think this only happens in the secular spaces. Unfortunately, it doesn't. It is as ripe and rampant amongst Christian-run orphanages. These preferential abusers are infiltrating short-term missions teams and trips. We are seeing it happen everywhere, and it's just not worth it. The heightened risk to these children is not worth it. And that's why we're saying We understand that orphanages have a role in the continuum of care, and yes, there still needs to be some orphanages. Yes, we need to scale it right back, and then yes, it needs to look very different and only be used in those last resort and temporary situations. But orphanage tourism, we're saying we need to ban this practice because it poses too great a risk to children. It's not that we're accusing people of being child exploiters or abusers, but it just opens up an environment and situation that poses really grave risks to children. We've gone through the trafficking bit. Parliamentary inquiry. So as you may have heard, the Modern Slavery Act inquiry that took place last year and ended with a report released in December looked at orphanage trafficking and orphanage tourism as a part of its scope. At the end of the inquiry, the government, well, Parliament, the Senate Committee, Joint Standing Committee, released 11 recommendations pertaining to orphanage trafficking and orphanage tourism, including a recommendation that it was included in the definition of modern slavery and therefore would be covered by the Modern Slavery Act. It also included recommendations that the Australian government launch awareness-raising campaigns to educate the Australian public around the dangers associated with orphanage tourism and orphanage volunteering to discourage the practice, and a whole lot of recommendations looking at different regulations and different policy measures that the government could introduce to try to ensure that Australians also weren't being taken advantage of, that our funding, our volunteering is being directed towards organisations that are operating in accordance with both domestic law in these countries as well as the international child rights law framework that we've discussed. Some of those recommendations have already been implemented, including the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Smart Volunteering campaign that was released earlier this year. This is all online on DFAT's website if you want to go and download some of the materials and the press statements. But they are now actively advocating for smart volunteering and discouraging volunteering or visiting orphanages whilst overseas. So you can go on and see the government's campaign around that. At the moment, they're also doing specific targeted outreach, particularly amongst universities and with gap year students, as that's the research that we've done has shown that quite a significant number of people who volunteer in orphanages are in that age group. There are, at the moment, there's the Modern Slavery Act, which is going to come out in the next couple of months, but will be in Parliament this month. What they have said now is that orphanage trafficking will be one of the reportable types of modern slavery under the Act. So the Modern Slavery Act is essentially going to be a business reporting requirement that's enacted by the legislation. And companies who are above that threshold will need to report on how they're looking at their supply chains to make sure that there's no types of slavery or trafficking taking place within their supply chains. Orphanage trafficking and orphanage tourism are included as a form of trafficking and exploitation that companies need to be looking at when they do their reporting. So at this point, the threshold's very high, so that won't affect the average Australian company. It'll only affect around 3,000 companies. But it's basically the first government globally to take a stance and say and recognise this as a form of exploitation and as a form of modern slavery. They've also confirmed that it is prosecutable under our criminal code as well. So that's a pretty strong stance our government's taken. So in terms of how do we make sure that our short-term missions and our volunteering practices are really contributing towards the best interests of children if we're engaging with children or child-centric programming overseas? What we're promoting instead of orphanage volunteering or orphanage tourism is looking at short-term missions through an ethics framework. It's very difficult to give people a list of do's and don'ts to say, don't do this one, but do this one instead. Here's all the things that are safe. Because as we know, and those of us that have had a lot of experience in the mission sector know, these are complex environments. There's a lot of different complex dynamics that we need to take into account. So rather than having that very black and white perspective, we're promoting that we look at this through an ethics lens, which means these 4 considerations. Our volunteering and short-term missions practices need to have the right goals. They need to have the right motivation, the right means or methodologies to be employed, and they need to be governed by the right directing principles. So best practice principles for whatever sector we're getting involved in, as well as biblical principles. But we also need to think about good and right for who? Good and right for us as volunteers, good and right for us as sending organisations, good and right for us as charities who receive volunteers, who might also be our donors, good and right for who? Unless our ethics framework really considers this from the vantage point of the most vulnerable person in the chain of people involved in short-term missions and volunteering, then it's not actually ethics, it's privilege. And so if we want to move beyond privilege practices into an ethics framework, we really need to make sure whatever we do is good and right when considered from the vantage point of the person who has the least amount of power. When we talk about short-term missions, there's all these different actors. There's the sending organisation, there's the volunteer or the team member, there's the receiving organisation, there's the community that's hosted. And then there is often this group of vulnerable people who are the beneficiaries of programs, such as children in orphanages. And they are the most vulnerable. They are the person with the least amount of power in that chain of actors in a short-term missions trip. And if the activity is not in their best interests, then it's not good and right, and it's not ethical. It's an exercise of privilege. And so it's so important that we go beyond assessing what do I want to do when I'm on a trip, what is good for my team, what will do good for my church's short-term missions team and program, what will do good for the person over there that we're interacting with, what will do good for the child's parents, for that host community, what is in their best interests. Because unless we consider it from that perspective, we end up with this ethical dilemma. We end up with a situation where children in particular, being one of the most popular groups of people for people to volunteer and interact with on a trip, children become the means of creating an experience for teams and volunteers that is based upon their preferences. And so we end up utilising children. They once again become like a commodity that are there to serve the goals and the desires of teams or of volunteers. So if it remains volunteer-centric and not child-centric, then we run the risk of actually commodifying children and communities overseas, and often unintentionally getting involved in practices that are therefore unethical. So to make our practices ethical, we really need to consider it from the vantage point of the other person. And these are some potential models that generally lend themselves towards ethical practice. Exposure trips that are all about learning and understanding what does it look like and mean to work and live in another country, in another culture. Opportunities for people who might be exploring a sense of being long-term called by God to work in a missions capacity, to go on a short-term trip so that they can understand what that calling might mean, what it might look like, what does it really entail to immerse yourself in another culture. Learning and advocacy trips, where we go overseas to learn. Rather than to do, we go to learn. Learn about the issues, learn about the vulnerabilities, learn about the complex social and political dynamics that create poverty and affect these communities. Learn about them so that when we come home, we can advocate in the place where we have the social networks, where we have the influence, where we have that long-term ability to actually create change. So learning and advocacy trips and asset-based trips. So these are trips where we look at the skills and the assets of local communities. What are they already doing? How are they mobilizing their own skills and their own resources to create change? And how can we participate in those efforts rather than drive an agenda that's ours and we bring all of the resources and all of the skills that are ours? How do we contribute to the agenda of the local community that's being driven by the assets they have, the goals that they have? How do we work together with local communities to participate, not to determine their development agendas? All of this information and more is on our ethical missions trip website, which the address will be up here at some point. Here, there's manuals on there around child protection and short-term missions. There's that whole ethics framework is unpacked on the ethical missions trips website. There's a whole bunch of tools, downloadable resources that organisations, individual volunteers, churches can use to really go through that decision-making process of really wrestling with what activity are we considering? How does it measure up when we put it through that ethics filter? Is it in the best interests of the communities we're going to engage with? So they're all free and available online to help guide more ethical practice. We're going to come around a time of Q&A in a second, but lastly, just to say, these are our core principles around ethical considerations. Think about who you send and make sure that we are screening and vetting the people so that we've done everything in our power to be sending safe people overseas to these communities. Where we go, Who do we partner with on the ground? Working with reputable organisations. One of our strengths as Christians is that we see the best in people. The flip side and weakness of that is that we often quickly form these trusting relationships without looking below the surface, and we can get tricked and exploited off the basis of that. So really doing our homework around assessing our partnerships and making sure that they're robust, so that we are going to work with good organisations. What we do, engaging in activities that have good outcomes for people on the ground, regardless of how emotive or positive the experience might be for us as volunteers or teams, we've got to think about how that impacts the communities we work with. And why we do it, making sure that our motivation is driven by what's in the best interest of those communities or those children, not what is good for our CVs or what is a fun experience or what looks good on Facebook or Snapchat or whatever we might be utilising. It has to be driven by a motivation that is considering the other. And how we go about it, making sure that we're contributing to long-term strategies, understanding that when we go for a short period of time, and if we're not contributing to a longer-term strategy, we're most likely contributing to something that's very unsustainable and quite potentially harmful. So doing our best to make sure that we have a lot of longer-term, more sustainable efforts in how we volunteer. Before I jump over to Q&A, I want to invite Belinda to just briefly come up and say hello and share with you. The reason why Belinda's here, Belinda is an ACCI field worker and one of our connected program partners, and she's running an amazing work in Lesotho. But Belinda has a good story to share, a vantage point to share from, in that we first connected over a conversation not dissimilar to this, didn't we?
Yeah.
Where Belinda had a particular idea in her mind and then engaged with some of this information and learning and really went through that wrestling process and has really come out the other end with a very innovative program. And she's just going to share for 2 minutes around that. But the purpose is twofold. To show you that it works. It's not theory. This works. We see it work. We've seen it work in so many different countries. We've seen these ideas be able to create really great sustainable programs that really can uphold and protect children in their families. So despite all the complexities of these developing countries with, the various political issues and stability issues, God's principles work. And God's design was always family. So Belinda's just going to quickly just give you a bit of a case study to take it out of the theoretical space and more into the practice space.
I don't really want to hold this, but I will. So I'm Belinda. I work in a country called Lesotho, which is in Africa, down the bottom, Southern Africa. About 6 years ago, I went there for a job. I intended to stay for 18 months, come back to Australia, get on with my life. But when I was there, I was confronted with a scene that many of you would have seen. As I walked to and from work each day, the road that I used had about 120 homeless children who would beg from me as I walked. And my heart broke, and I wanted to feed them all and build them a big house and be their mum. That was the plan, and that's when I talked to Beck. But I was in a very difficult position because I was practically volunteering. I could barely cover my own costs. I couldn't feed them, and I couldn't do any of these plans that I had. So I decided to do what I could with what I had. And I made a commitment that I would give my time and my love to every single child that ever came up to beg from me. And over the next 2 years, I spent hundreds of hours sitting on those streets with those children, getting to know them. And an incredible thing happened. Within about 3 or 4 times of having met a child, they stopped asking for anything. All they wanted to do was talk to me. They started meeting me on the road and walking me to work every morning. They wanted to talk. And over time, I would hear words like my aunt, my mother, my father, my grandmother. And I'm thinking, if these people are alive, why are you here? Why are you living in the streets? Why are you filthy? Why are you on drugs? Because in my mind, that would only happen if there was absolutely nobody. No, it wasn't true. It wasn't true. In that 2 years, I gathered a whole lot of information that completely changed my response to street children. And it completely changed what I wanted to do about it. And what I began to uncover was that society in Lesotho is very different to societies in Australia. Children do not belong to mum and dad in Lesotho. Children belong to the entire community. So when I began to look for families for children, I had a whole list of people that I had to consult about that child. And I just wanted to give you a snapshot of who was obligated to and responsible for this child. First and foremost, mum, dad, mum's parents, mum's grandparents, mum's brothers, mum's sisters, mum's aunts, cousins, nieces, nephews, father's parents, father's grandparents, father's brothers, sisters, aunts, cousins, nieces, nephews. I had to talk to neighbours, to the child's church, his or her former teachers, friends of the family, and the chief. And people always ask me, how do you manage to find families for children living on the streets? When you have consulted with all of those people, how do you come up with nothing?
Yeah, that's right.
So what we found was that there are a lot of reasons why a child would be separated from their families and a lot of reasons why they would end up on the street. But it was never because there was no way.
Yeah.
And if I could figure out why and what had broken, and if I could fix it, I could get kids off the streets. And I didn't need to build that house, and I didn't need to be their mum. So over the last 5 years, we have put more than 100 children off the streets into families. And we have a 95% success rate of keeping them there. They are some of the hardest kids you'll ever meet, drug addicted, aggressive, violent, but they transform in communities, and they transform when they're restored to being normal. So I'm here to encourage you guys. Impossible things are possible. Sometimes we just need more information, but these beautiful children deserve to be normal, not to be isolated, thrown to the side. Every child deserves to find their purpose. And yeah.
Yeah, can you just give me an example of, say, like a family member that you found, and what was the reason behind it?
Yeah, lots of different reasons.
Yeah.
You'll have a very small group where mum and dad have died and the rest of the family kind of didn't really want responsibility, so they just left him. And the child waited to be absorbed into that community. No one came, so they went to the streets. Very small proportion.
Yeah.
The rest, you will find father has died, mum remarried, stepfather makes it uncomfortable for the child. Sometimes you'll find child stolen something, child has done something wrong, and the child's too scared to go home. But mum didn't come to look for him in the streets. So he just came for a day, came for a week, and it turned into 3 years. But we can always find the reason.
And so when you bring them back, what's kind of like the response?
We don't just bring kids back further. First, we have to explore where's the best place for this child. If there's something really wrong in that home that they ran away from, we wouldn't just take them back there. But the question I always ask the child is, tell me about the person who loves you most in the world. If I can find that person, I can find a home. Yeah.
Rebecca, I've got a question from someone saying, I'm interested in what you mean by asset-based trips.
Yeah, okay. So asset-based development is a particular theory of community development that is community-led, and a lot of development models are what we call deficit-based models. So they look at what's wrong, what's missing, what the needs are. An asset-based model looks at what's healthy, what's functioning, what the assets are. And it's based on the premise that if you start from what people have and what they can do and what they know, and you leverage those assets collectively into what they want to explore or develop or the goals that they have, you're going to be able to empower people in their own development journey, which means that it is more likely to be sustainable and is more likely to overcome the actual causes of poverty that are much more likely to not be around a deficit of resource, but to be around a disempowerment process. And so that's a theory of development. Asset-based trips basically link short-term missions and volunteering to that type of development. So where a lot of trips or teams come in, they come in to do things, they come in to fix things, and so they come in looking at the deficit model. But what that tends to do is further disempower communities, because again, it comes in as, we don't mean it this way, but it can be perceived as, you know, the wealthier, more privileged, more educated, more able people come in and identify what's broken in our communities, and they use their resources to fix it, because sometimes can solidify an existing message of, I'm not good enough, I can't change what's not working in my community or my life. And so it reinforces that inferiority complex that can underlie poverty. And so the asset-based model is the opposite to that. It looks at how can I as a team not come in with my agenda and say I'm coming here to fix this issue or fix that issue and do things for communities, but I believe that communities have strengths. I believe that communities have vision. I believe that God has gifted them in the same way he's gifted me. And I want to bring the gifts that God's given me alongside the gifts that he's given them, but recognize that it's their community. It's their life. It's their future, and it's their right to set that trajectory. So whatever it looks like for me to support that existing process, that's how a team can lead to an asset-based development process and end up utilizing an asset-based short-term missions model.
Does the train the trainer type model fit in within that? Where
It can.
they're
Often,
coming alongside people of
Yeah.
equal
Yeah.
gifting?
it can. They'll often come under a skills volunteering type of program
Yep.
where you've got a specific skill exchange. Where it is more of an asset model, where it's a two-way learning. So
Yep.
where it's more of an exchange of skills and information versus a one-way transfer.
Yep.
And that one-way transfer isn't illegitimate. It's just usually a skills-based volunteering placement. Sure. So in Cambodia, where I worked, we have a quite extensive network of community-led development projects, and we use them as a family strengthening mechanism in communities that are quite vulnerable to separation due to poverty and different things. And so the community, they all determine what they're going to work on together. They map out their assets. They will set goals one by one. They'll often form development committees where they build consensus around what they're going to do. And in a lot of those communities, they'll often look at things like food security as a priority. So in these particular networks of communities, they had access to land. They had unstable water sources. So you go from drought to flood, drought to flood. And so one of the things they came up with is looking at small-scale permaculture farms in their backyards as a food security measure. And so we were able to link them with a local trainer who came and did the training initially in the community, and then they formed themselves into work teams to dig the fish ponds and to set up the fish farms, to plant the vegetables around and set up these small permaculture farms. So when we had teams coming in, sometimes when we talk to a community and say, there's a team coming through, they want to come and look at what you've done. They want to learn from you. And in the first instance, it would be to come in and just to see what's happened. And what you would find is these communities they'd be fighting over whose home gets to be visited, because they've done this. They've transformed it with their own hands and their own ideas and their own assets, and they are so keen to share that with people, because having someone come from overseas to look at what you've achieved is like, oh my gosh, they're interested in me.
Yeah.
Like, this is significant enough that they want to come and see this. The empowerment that happens with that is really significant. But what we've also been able to do is sometimes the communities will come back and say, well, we've got 3 or 4 households in the community where it's headed up by someone with a disability, but we've got an elderly widow who's looking after small children. They need a bit more support around the actual physical labour. And we'll set up community work teams in the community to help do that. And sometimes we'll pair volunteers with them. And it's not that the community needs the labour of the volunteer. It's more like, well, look, come and be part of it. You've got arms, you've got muscles, here's a hoe, jump in the dirt with us, help us dig this fish pond. And what we love about that is the relationship that it forms. It's the being in the mud together, working together, sitting down and eating together, having a tea or a coffee at the end of, a 5-hour stint of digging the big hole. It's the mutual experience that's fostered, where it's not I'm better than you and you're more inferior to me. It's like, we got a goal, we can work on this together, we're all just people at the end of the day. And so those kinds of things. So the team hasn't set the agenda. They've come alongside what the community's already doing. It's entirely empowering, but it also allows them to get involved, but not in a way that undermines the long-term development process. That's one example. Yeah.
Can I just say, I'm glad you bring this across. And one of the things that you are saying is, why is so much, what's wrong with us as a community? Because, people just become a little bit close. What's wrong with us?
Yeah.
They won't know there's something wrong with us.
Yeah.
Of course, there's not. So it's looking at, and in Australia in particular, how funding works is that the more unemployment, the more single parenting, the more people on drugs, the more this, the more that, and funding goes into that.
Yeah, that's right. And in a lot of developing countries, there's a lot, and we don't mean to do this, but it's that understanding different cultural lenses and different value systems. My husband's Cambodian. And he was born 6 months after the Cambodian genocide broke, which really didn't mean the war was over. The war went on for the next 10 years. Because at the dates they talk about the end of the Khmer Rouge War was just the city. So they spent the next decade pushing the Khmer Rouge out. So he grew up, his childhood was in war. And his family were rich before the war, but they lost everything. Everything. And went back to had to hide as farmers. They tried to kill his dad so many times. It's an absolute miracle he survived. But as a result, my husband grew up at the very end of the height of the war and grew up in a decade of war, and they had nothing. His dad chose a piece of land right next to a lake, so at least he knew you could send the kids down to pull fish out of the lake to eat. They had nothing. But you asked my husband, when did you work out you were poor? And he said, when UNTAC came in. Then they told us we were poor. We didn't know we were poor. We had enough food. We played in the fields. We were free. My dad was an educator, so he set up a school. He re-established the high school in our province. We got told we were poor when the Western UNTAC servicemen came in, and they pointed to the disparity. And he was like, and there's so many articles that talk about that. So sometimes the deficit model we introduce because we don't understand the different value systems, and that's where we can unintentionally reinforce some of these notions of inferiority, which actually deepen someone's experience of poverty over time. So yeah, there's a lot of those different issues that come up in the development space more generally, but short-term missions has an intersect with some of those issues, which is why, again, we don't want to discourage volunteering, we want to encourage it, but we want to encourage it to happen in an environment of thoughtfulness and consideration and, really critical reflection about those 5 things. What are our motivations? What are our goals? What is the end result of these activities? Do they validate someone's equality and their empowerment and their destiny and their sense of who God created them to be, or does it do the opposite even though that's not intentional?
Thanks for your talk, and thanks for reinforcing some things to us. We've been to Kenya 7 times. We're off again here of mission travel in a month.
Right.
This time and the last couple of times we've been going to help a local guy who is helping extremely poor build houses.
Mm-hmm.
Shelter is our first prime need.
Yeah.
And we don't go with the idea is we know everything, we'll tell you what to do. We've seen some of it there.
Yeah.
You have to go and get to know them and work with them.
Yeah.
For what they need.
That's right, exactly.
And it is amazing the friends you make.
Yeah.
And what really happens.
Absolutely. And relationship, if you think about God's model of transformation, it's a relational model. What sin did is break relationship. What Jesus came to reform and re-establish was relationship. And so when our missions activities and our development activities feed into that redevelopment and re-establishment and rebuilding of relationships, I personally think that's where we best align with what God's redemptive plans in the world are. So fully support what you're saying.
Nice loud voice. If you're gonna, sorry, nice loud voice so it can come up in the recording.
Sorry, you said that you've been in South Africa for 5 years. Is that
I've been
right?
there 6.5 years, yeah.
Are you still
I'm
in
still
South
there.
Africa?
Lesotho, yeah, Southern Africa. I'll go back in 2 weeks. I'm just here for a visit.
So you're still doing the same work with the kids on the street?
We actually don't have any more. We go every week and we check for new kids. Where we used to do work on the street 5 days a week, we spend half a day now. We were given land by the government in one of the feeder communities. We kept finding kids all arriving from the same village. We've relocated in there and we're doing a lot of this prevention work that's talking about trying to stop it happening in the first place, working with dysfunctional families, family breakdown, yeah. So, yes, I'll be going back in 2 weeks.
Congratulations.
No, it's marvellous because you'll find when new children arrive on the street, there's no one to join because it's empty. So it actually makes this a lot easier for us to move them off. Yeah.
I can just say we've seen the horrible side of the Western assault in Kenya.
Yeah.
We first went to an orphanage run by an Australian man who was the most horrible man I have ever met in my life. And I even employed a lawyer to try and get him, but he was paying money to everybody.
Yeah.
we've also seen the money issue in terms of we were helping at school for a number of years, and whilst the chairman always sent me a receipt when I sent money, we never knew whether it was spent on what we sent it from.
Yeah.
And in the end, we said, we're not transparent, we can't help you anymore.
Yeah, that's right. And that just points to the need for, you know, as we said in those 5 principles about who you're sending to, those processes around really looking at due diligence in partnership are so important, because probably one of the most common scenarios we come across is someone travels over to an overseas country, they meet someone, there's a relationship that's forged in that short period of time, and that leads to a partnership, but there's no deeper assessment of what the person's actually doing. Are they legally licensed to operate the activities that they're operating? Are they setting this up properly? Are there good, you know, financial management procedures in place to make sure that everything's above board? And yeah, as I said before, our trust in humanity is one of our strengths. It's also can be one of the areas that leaves us vulnerable. And it's just really important because we also, not only to make sure that the resources we have are used wisely, but because there are people who are exploiting that. And when that exploitation happens, communities and children also end up being utilized and exploited to get access to our money that we give with the best of intentions. So doing our due diligence not only protects us and protects our investment in missions, it protects communities and children as well.
And it needs to be an ongoing due diligence because we're all sinners and we're all subjected to temptation. So we've had situations in Zimbabwe where we've had a pastor of a church set up, you know, not an orphanage, but after school care programs and other programs within their church community. And over a number of years, the temptation of just having Western money and Western support coming in got to a point where he started to embezzle that money. So, you know, the temptation that comes with that and the ongoing transparency is very important because what they were doing 5 years ago to what they're doing now can be quite
Yeah.
And that's sort of the trouble. They think that we've got a lot of money, and to them, we are. But here, we're in a different situation with taxes. Everything is more expensive.
Yeah.
They don't see that, but it becomes very easy for them to say, oh, I haven't paid my rent, or I haven't done this, and naturally expect you to pay the money to get them out of that situation.
Yeah.
And that's very hard.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. And all those things, again, can be mitigated through good partnership structures, very clear guidelines and parameters around what the nature of the partnership is, that keeps everything in a pretty clear space. But yeah, things can change, as you said, and we just need to maintain that diligence for everybody's sake.
I just want to say, you honestly blessed me. I went to Manila last year because we had a bit of money saved up to buy a house, just a deposit. But I felt Jesus say to me, you know what compassion feels like. So we held on to that money and went to an orphanage, Manila. And so we went back again the second time around in March. I have to take my 3 kids with me. So my husband and I switched. So one day he's there and, you know, we found out a lot more about the government orphanages there and how they actually medicate them and abuse them and so many things. So this, the orphanage that we've been volunteering in is a Canadian woman who basically just, she lives there with the kids. She's called Mum. She sees it as her home. Kids do get adopted and fostered, but she tries to do her best way to keep them as short as they can there. But most of the time, like you said, they kind of use it as a place to leave the kids. So a lot of the women will come back and she tries to give them jobs, and it's quite frustrating for her. She's doing it on her own. And she's got 2 adopted Filipinos. Now, the thing is, I'm not doing any of this because it's my dream. I feel like God's called me, and in many ways I've been kind of like, it's like as if it's so blurry where he wants me to go. And you just come in, she invited me from church, and I'm like, I'm bringing my kids whether it's rain, hail, or shine. Because I feel like as if when God just gives you an open door, you just go in, you don't know what you're doing. So we're going again in 2 weeks. And, you know, we're saving the money, but we're not going to use it for anything. My husband works in the financial company, so he's going to try and do a presentation with his work just to see if we can get some funding. I don't even know what I'm doing, but it's so great that he showed me a different concept of having to take care of these kids, because a lot of those kids that we saw in there, they just want someone to love them, you know, and some of them are still waiting for their mum and dad. It's really sad. And I know some of the parents are use drugs a lot. They still would rather go home to their parents. So I know that as much as the carers are beautiful and they cry when the kids leave and all that, there is that. Yes,
that's right.
And I don't know what God wants us to do, but I do know that I'm committed to following Jesus because I know it's the real deal. And I do know that the spiritual blessing that I get is so far more than I've ever experienced before I met Jesus. So, you know, it's so good that you're here, and I'm sure we're going to have to catch up because I'm like this girl who doesn't know anything, and you seem like, you know, I think the hardest thing when you step into places like this is I go to God, who am I? I really am.
Do that.
Oh, well, you seem like
oh
quite
no,
important.
I still do that.
The way you speak and everything. But yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you've been hands and feet, like, you know, we're just, we haven't quite gotten there
but
yet,
we all
as you can
start
tell.
somewhere. And I think that what you've shown in being here tonight is that you're coupling passion with a desire to learn. And that's when we really become effective vessels for God to do his work. Not when we just respond emotionally to a call, but when we couple that with learning and a desire to say, God, I don't only just want to make myself available, I want to equip myself to do what you're asking me to do it wisely and effectively and with knowledge and skill. And so investing in coming to trainings like this, or to, you know, jumping onto some of those websites we listed, and there's lots of links to other websites, and absorbing as much of that information as you can. So when you go and you're sitting down with this Canadian lady who's running this home, you can help her really start to think through some ways of how do we, you know, speed up that process of being able to restore families so kids can be reunited. How can you use the funding that you're raising through, you know, your husband's workplace and so forth, to be the seed funding for some of those opportunities to pilots and different things with her. You know, the more knowledge you bring alongside that passion, the more you're able to be that iron sharpens iron with her, and be a voice that gives her courage to try different things and have a safe space to innovate. So I think that you're bringing those two things together is really commendable, and is really important, because if we only respond to God emotionally, we don't bring our heads on that journey, that's where we end up with good intentions that end up not leading to the types of outcomes that we envisage that they would and desired that they would. So well done.
We just need to keep it simple. I can just say, I was in Mozambique in 2006, and my niece was running a mission at the time. It was the first time she'd been there, and I felt like time to go. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. But when I got there, my background in asset-based community development, which you know about, she just asked me, the local people needed, she thought they really needed some help training around health. So they knew nothing about the bodies, the body telling. And anyway, and I thought, okay, and I'd only just got there now before, and I took my interpreter, and I said to her, okay, how does the system work around here, government, whatever else? She said, well, it's chiefs or secretary or one as well. And the nearest one was just over the road, literally over the road from here, over the road. And I said, come on, let's walk there. One is that people, that's okay. And I walked over there, and I was talking to the chief, and I said, my niece is over there. That, you know, maybe we could do a women's health seminar. And I said, well, what would you and the women do now? That's all I said. You know, open this huge door. Huge door. Where I was teaching first aid in what foreign languages to help us understand. Anyway, that's just one thing. So it could be simple, is what I'm saying. Just ask.
Ask and then listen.
That's right.
Ask.
That's right. Great.
Okay, well, I think that's covering everything. I hope that your minds and your hearts have been stretched, as mine have again. Just really, I think, encourage you to just prayerfully meditate on what part of the message it is that's resonating with you, and investigate further. On the Mission Travel website, we have a tab on the top of our toolbar at the top called Travel Extras, and you can go into the mission resource areas and all those websites that we've talked about tonight, and different articles about being a good missionary or not a good missionary are on our website, so you're very welcome to use those resources as well. So thank you all so much for coming on such a chilly, wintry Melbourne night. We really loved this presentation and we would love to do it again. So we will look at doing it maybe later on in the year. So if there are people that you're thinking of that you think, oh, such and such needs to hear about this, please get them to contact us at Mission Travel, and we will let you know when we will reschedule this later on in the year. Poor Rebecca, she's in high demand, but I think it's really worthwhile continuing this process of education and sharing and learning with one another. So go in peace, and thanks so much for coming.
Thank you very much.